So for the next video, I'm going to be building a fish tank stand, and this is just the frame for that stand. I don't know if this is going to make it into one video, so if not, skinning it will be in the second part of the video. Now this stand is 36 by 12 and a half, and that's the actual size of the tank that's going on top of this. And on top of the tank, there's going to be a canopy as well. So the final height for this is going to be 53 inches. So the tank for this is a 46-gallon tank, and water weighs about 8.2, 8.3 pounds per gallon. So you're going to have about 380 pounds of water in the tank alone. That's not going to account for the weight of the actual tank and whatever you put inside of it. So you're already looking at like 400 pounds plus for one of these smaller sized tanks. I overbuilt the base a little bit. The 4x4s are on the corners are probably overkill for a tank this size, but I wanted to design something that you could use for smaller tanks, but also expand it and have longer runs for larger tanks as well, without having to redesign the entire setup. The bulk of the design came from making something that was stable for holding up all that weight. And the issues you are going to run into aren't compression, because if you have a 2x4 on edge like this and your weight's pushing down the top, it's going to take a ton of force to get this to bow even a little bit, much more so than if it was mounted like this. So the actual lumber, you're fine with using these structural grade, construction grade pieces of lumber. Now I know if you go to a store and get it, a lot of times they're made out of 3/4 inch plywood, even particle board, and the problem with plywood is not that it can't hold the weight, because plywood can, but the problem is going to be your joints. All your strength in a structure like this is going to come from where your members meet and where they join. So in plywood, when you have a 3/4 inch piece meeting at a corner, you don't have a lot of meat to work with those joints. So for this, one of the reasons I use the 4x4s is because I could cut a decent amount off of it and still have it be structural, but also hold up all of my pieces. So the design basically came from how you make your walls in your house. So you'll have a bottom plate, a stud, and a top plate. And if you have a second floor, you're always lining up your studs on top of the studs on the first floor, so the load transfers on top of each other. So one of the designs I would see a lot would be people mounting them like this, and the problem with that is there's no transfer of the load if you're putting something on the side to the legs. So with this, the bulk of your strength is coming from the 4 joints on top as well as the 4 joints on the bottom. And I remove this bottom plate so you could see what that looks like. So this is basically a 4x4 that I notched out here and along the side, so that these width members could sit on it, and then your cross members could sit on it as well. So all your load is being pushed down on top of this, and this can't move, it can't sag, and it can't sink, because it has the same joint in the bottom as well. You can see how it goes all the way to the floor on that side. Now you'll see in my video, I'm going to cut these notches out with a tending jig on my table saw. And if you don't have a setup like that, you could always laminate 2 2x4s together to get this similar to shape as a 4x4, but cut one long and leave one short, and you'll have that natural lip for your boards to sit on. And then you could just trim with a handsaw off one corner of that 2x4, and you'll essentially have the same corners as the ones that I have. It's just one less step to go with the 4x4. Now this stand's made out of the 4x4s are Douglas fir, and then the 2x4s are just regular pine 2x4s. Now if you go to a big box store and spend time looking for these, you can find ones that are fairly straight and don't have a lot of twists to them, and you're going to want those for building something like this. Trying to build something that needs to be square out of unsquare lumber is really hard. If you're also going to make something like this, you're going to want to buy this lumber and then make it fairly quickly. If you let this sit for 2 or 3 weeks, even if you bought them straight, the chances of them still being straight are fairly slim. Now that they're cut, some of my edges are a little rough, so I'm just going to run them through my table saw and clean up those edges. I cut down those 2x4s in my radial arm saw, and the measurements of the tank are 36 1/4, and I cut these at 36 5/16 just to give me the slightest bit of leeway in case the tank has a little bit of undulation in any parts that will still fit on this base. I put my tending jig on my fence, and then I set my blade so it's going to cut 1.5 inches over from the edge for that 2x4. Now the blade on this saw only goes up about 1/2 inch, so I'm going to have to trim off a little bit when I make my cross cuts to cut out those laps, which isn't a big deal because this will be nice and straight. So now I could go through and run all these through this way, turn it, run it through again, and then do the bottom side as well. And with all those cuts made into my pieces, I took a measurement to look, and it cut up 3 1/8. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all those 2x4s I already cut and rip them down to 3 1/8. So the 2x4 is going to be 3 1/2, and I'm just going to rip it down to 3 1/8. I'm not going to, for a size tank that this is the size I'm working with, I'm not going to lose any strength by doing that, taking off a little less than 1/2 inch. And it will just make life easier because I won't have to figure out a way to keep it square and remove this extra material. With those 2x4s ripped down, I could keep my fence at that 3 1/8, and then I lowered my blade down to 1 1/2. I'm going to use a combination of my miter gauge and the fence to run all these through and remove the excess on these, keeping this one square in place. So with all those pieces cut off, this is what I'm left with. That L for my 2x4s to sit in there, and that little notch left over to screw into. I'm laying these out on my table saw to start screwing together the fronts and the backs, and I'm orienting them so that notch is going to be on the inside, so that way the 2x4s I cut are going to go across the front, and then the ones that are going to determine the depth are going to go here, as well as can be screwed to the front on this one. So I have my fence in place, and I'm using that to kind of keep everything straight. I also usually put a lot of this sort of stuff together with drywall screws because they're inexpensive, but I bought a little nicer grade screw for these. Before I move on to the next step with these connected, I'm going to check all my corners for square, and if you cut those notches out properly, this pretty much squares itself up, which is my case here. This is perfectly square. With the front and the back made, I set them up on my table saw as they would be in the space. And since you have 1.5 inches on each 2x4, and this needs to be 12.5 deep to fit the fish tank, you're losing 3 inches. So I cut 4 pieces that are 9.5. I actually cut them 9 and 9/16 just to give myself a little bit of leeway. And now I could go through and start attaching those. Now when I cut those pieces on my radial arm saw, since I trimmed these down to 3 1/8, I also had to trim those. With my frame together, I'm going to start adding my supports, and I decided to put 4 on top and 4 on bottom, which is probably a little bit of overkill, but since this is for someone else, I don't want to have to worry about it not being strong enough. And I put 2 on either side of these 2x4s to sandwich, the 4x4s to sandwich them in there to just add more strength to the bottom, and then 2 in the center. And the bottom's going to get a piece of wood so you can put stuff on it, and then you'll have something to screw into in the middle, which will be nice. Also, with these 2x4s, they're construction grade 2x4s, so over time you don't want these bowing out away from where they're screwed into your post, which is something that they will do. So adding these extra in the middle will help keep everything square over time. So now that I have all my pieces cut, and mine ended up being the same size as my sides, which is 9 and 9/16, I just cut 8 of those, and I'm just going to screw them in through the fronts with the same screws. The last support I'm going to put on this frame is a middle support right in the front. And I think there's more than enough wood on this already to support the weight of the fish tank. So this middle support is mostly going to be the purpose of framing out the 2 front doors. Now if you were making something for a much bigger tank or something much wider and longer, you would probably want to start adding some middle supports on the front and the back going down your span. Since this one's pretty small and I already have very bulky corners, I'm not going to worry about adding much more support to this. So I marked middle on both sides of my 2x4 as well as middle on both sides, top and bottom of my piece. And since this is 36.25, my halfway mark was about 18 1/8. And I could just put my center support right in the middle and line everything up. So to skin this, I have this 1/4 inch beadboard. Now the customer wanted this beadboard. The design includes beadboard, and they wanted it made out of birch because it was going to work with the finish the best. This beadboard is only a 1/4 inch. Ideally it would be thicker because you're going to get strength by what you put on the outside of your box. Now luckily this tank is fairly small and I overbuilt it purposely, so I'm not super worried about the thinness of this. But if you are using this design to make a bigger tank, I would definitely recommend something a little bit thicker. So the height on this stand right now is 21 3/4. So I already ripped this down to a usable side, and I'm just going to start measuring width and height and cutting this down and attaching it to the sides. I have the 2 sides from my stand cut, and I ended up beveling the edges on a 45, which will give me a little bit more coverage for the glue. So I put that panel board on either sides of my cabinet, and that was obviously just a matter of measuring the height and the width and cutting it, but I also kept it a little long because I put a 45 on either end, and that's just so the corners meet up a little bit nicer than a butt joint. So then I measured for the distance in between those two, and I cut another piece for the front. So now that I see that I measured that properly and it fits in between these two side pieces, I could go and brad nail it in place. Now originally I was going to put a piece in the front and then piece out all the pieces and connect them to the pieces of 2x4, but on something like this, especially beadboard where you already have lines, the seams are going to be so much easier to see. So it's worth it to take the extra time to just cut it as one sheet, and I actually cut it long. And then I'm going to go through and trim out the squares for the doors, and also trim along the top and bottom with the trim bit in my router so everything is nice and flush. Before I put this together, I'm obviously going to put glue on these corners, but these corners are most likely, I'm pretty sure they're still going to have some trim pieces on them, so the corners are not super important. And I'm also going to stick with putting my brads towards the tops and the bottoms of this beadboard, because there's going to be 2-inch trim along the top and the bottom, and you won't have to worry about filling in any holes from those finishing nails. So I flipped this upside down after attaching that front piece, and I'm just going to drill a little pilot hole into the corner of where that door opening is going to be. I don't want to drill a full-size hole because it will tear out the pattern on the other side. Now with it flipped right side up again, I could find that hole, and my trim bit's like a 3/8 inch bit, so I'm going to drill a 1/2 inch hole. So then I put a 3/8 inch trim bit in my router and set the plunge depth so that this bearing comes in contact with the inside 2x4, and I'm going to trace both of these squares and cut out those door holes. With my doors cut out, I cut most of these panels oversized, and now I'm going to go through and trim all the edges against the bottoms and tops of the 2x4s as well. So I think this is where I'm going to stop off this video with just the skins put on there, and then the next video will be making the canopy, the doors, and all the trim and molding to put on this. Now the other nice thing about cutting this out with the router like that is now you have the inserts that will go on the inside of your doors already pretty close to being cut down to size. And one thing I didn't show in the video is I did trim out the back of this. And I know I said I wasn't going to put this center support in there, but I ended up putting one in the back as well, because in the picture the customer sent me, there is one in the back, so I just decided to put it in there. But you can see the difference. This one I just put pieces, so it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces, and you could see how the seams can be distracting, especially if you're going to be putting a stain finish on there. Your eyes will really notice those seams. Now the back isn't super important. You don't even have to trim it out, because this one's going to be against the wall. You're never going to see it. But I had the lumber, and it looks nicer than 2x4, so I just did it.